Hello everybody, it's the Alco Diesel Guy with another build for the Bachmann project. As you see, yet again, it's an F9 unit, but if we look very closely at the box, yep, that's right. Despite being a vintage Bachmann locomotive, this is in fact an 8-wheel drive locomotive variation of the F9 that we did before. As we can see by this next shot, unfortunately, this locomotive is suffering from one of the early Bachmann 8-wheel drive locomotive side effects. It's called Zinc Rot, where the anti-corrosive properties put into the metal actually attack and break the plastic off, as we see by this chunk of plastic missing right here. Also note how similar this locomotive is to its 4-wheel drive counterpart. Essentially, it's the same shell was placed on that locomotive. This is essentially where it was beforehand. And, well, that's enough background. Let's give this thing a test and see how well she runs. And yes, considering the fact that she runs like a bag of nails crossed with a dying cat, basically it sounds like this locomotive needs desperate help. The locomotive disassembles the same way its 4-wheel drive successor would later on. All we do is simply pull the shell away from the actual chassis itself to drop the chassis out of position. We then carefully guide the shell around the coupler on the front so it can gain access to the locomotive unfeathered. We also quickly begin to notice that while the shell might be the same, the underpinnings are completely different. The motor is actually a can-style motor mounted in the center. It's actually a 5-pole motor, in sharp contrast to the pancake 3-pole motor that you see on the image above. And also, again, it has all-wheel drive, with 2 shafts running from either end of the locomotive to provide this power. I will freely and happily admit that I was intimidated when once I saw this locomotive for the first time under the hood. But to be honest, it's actually easier to work on than its pancake motor successor. We start off by removing the 4 screws that hold the top plate in place. This will allow us to gain access to the main transmission or drivetrain area of the locomotive and make it easier for us to do our work. Once the last screw is removed, the whole top piece can be simply lifted off the actual chassis itself. And under the hood, we find a drivetrain that's very simplistic yet extremely robust, along the lines of Irving Athearn trains in miniature blue box line. It's really stunning to think that Bachmann, who was reduced to building really cheap locomotives after this point, could build something so high quality. Anyway, enough reminiscing, let's go ahead and start to work here. The main issue appears to be with this locomotive, if it hasn't made itself obvious enough, is it needs lubrication. So we'll be using hobby lube grease, as you saw me grab before, to handle the gears, and we're also going to be lubing the bearings, which I'll start now. I'm going to use some Labelle 107 oil right on the motor bearings themselves. Please note, I'm not going into the commutator with this, I am just touching the bearings and on the motor itself, as well as the bearings and the couplers, and any other area where there are in fact bearings on the chassis itself to ensure they run smoothly and will not eat into the plastic. Next, we'll give the motor's commutator a lube utilizing conductive lubricant / cleaner. Again, all we do is place the brush right where the commutator is and manually rotate the motor over a few times to get this in place. Please note this is different from oil, as it will enhance conductivity as well as lubricate, and it won't burn off. It's designed to be exposed to motor brushes, and unlike the oil, which claims it doesn't burn off. It just actually works with the brushes and just enhances lubrication. And in case any of you are wondering, this is what conductive lubricant looks like. It's a clear liquid, unlike the oil, which is a yellowish liquid that I usually use. Next, we'll utilize a pair of pliers to pull the gear assemblies out of the actual motor drive system themselves so we can lubricate them. As you can see, they also have these sort of plastic bearings on them that also sit on the metal. We'll give those a shot of oil in just a second. But before we do that, we'll give the gear underneath the worm gear an actual shot of grease, as the lubricants appear to have dried into oblivion on this particular model. There is absolutely no trace of even residue on the gears of actually having lubricant. Next, we'll squeeze some grease into the grooves of the worm gear itself to make sure that's well lubed. Again, not much, just enough to get inside those grooves there. I am working hard to get the grease into all of the grooves, so when the gears make contact, they will make contact with the grease, not the gear itself. Now, I was going to try to be slick here and avoid pulling the motor to save some time, but it became very clear that my slick plan was actually taking more time than simply pulling the motor, and so I finally did so. To get the motor out, we simply remove the screw from the base of the locomotive, which will also remove the fuel tank. And with the screw successfully removed, the motor can simply be pulled free of its slot. Ha! Take that, Athearn, and your mounts that get reduced to chewing gum after a few years. With the motor now freely movable, we gain the distance necessary to hook up the coupler shaft, as well as the rest of the drive shafts, and get everything back together. First, we'll put some grease on either side of the coupler to avoid chafing on either the drive shaft or the motor connector. Once the grease is in place, we then carefully rotate the shaft into position, making sure to square the blocks off with the two slots in the actual frame itself. The shaft drops down and is able to make good contact with the drive gear below it for the truck. We'll repeat this procedure on the other shaft to ensure that that shaft runs smoothly and doesn't put unnecessary strain on the motor, as well as to stop it from making excessive noise itself. And with the shafts back in place, it's now time to screw the motor back down into position. To do this, we simply align the old fuel tank up, being very careful to guide the wire around the assembly. Insert the screw into the hole and turn it clockwise until it can't turn anymore. Next, we replace the upper weight or top assembly on top of the whole locomotive itself, being sure to guide the wire around correctly through the frame. This is actually a bit on the tricky side, as you can easily trap the wire for the headlight somewhere within the frame and damage it or break it. As you can see, I actually had to go back and take the fuel tank off to make sure the wire was properly located to avoid damaging it. It is well worth taking your time here because you do not want to have to replace this wire. It is a bit of a pain to trace down and hook in. And after resecuring the screw for a second time underneath the locomotive itself, we can move on to actually screwing the actual frame back together, utilizing the 4 stock screws. Everything tightly buttoned up, it's time to give her a test to see how she runs. And now the moment of truth. Will all of our hard work pay off, or have I just wasted about 40 or 50 minutes after work fixing this darn thing?
Oh yeah, listen to that. Considering how much noise this used to make, oh wow, that's a huge improvement. Yeah, that is a huge improvement.
Yep, it looks like I pulled this off and got yet another locomotive running for the upcoming Bachmann documentary. And so, with that all taken care of, let's put the shell back on. The first step again is to carefully thread the horn hook coupler through the hole in the pilot, Please be forewarned, this is a very tricky step a lot of people forget to do. I've seen several of these shells sold at train stores with the pilot broken off on the bottom, never to be properly reattached, if at all, again. Next, we carefully guide the shell back down onto the tabs, being very careful not to upset the already weakened plastic. Again, the zinc rod has set in on this. As we can see, there are a few little pieces of plastic kind of dangling from the base. After taking our time with the shell, we finally get everything back together, and the end result is definitely worth looking at. Let's give her one more test for good luck.
Back on the track it goes. That is a very satisfying result. Wasn't that it didn't run, but it just runs so much better now. Listen to that thing purr. That is a great result. I'm very happy with that. Okay, on to the next one.
And that'll just about do it for this next project on the long process of getting my Bachmann history documentary finished. I know a lot of you out there cannot wait to see this documentary, and I'm trying my best to get it out as soon as possible. And while I don't have a time frame for when it will premiere, I will say I'm working as hard as possible to make that as soon as possible. Again, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. Please subscribe, and again, as always, keep the metal side down.